Today we'll be talking about how to design and conduct a scientific experiment. So recently I wrote a paper and you should watch that video if you haven't already. But I had to learn how to conduct a scientific experiment in order to prove my hypothesis. So this video will go over all the basics of how to do that and some tips and tricks as well as examples. So there's three main components of a scientific experiment, which includes one clear question, controlled variables, and reliable measurements. And we'll go over those in more detail in the following slides. So the question should have a cause and effect under certain conditions, and those conditions should usually be controlled. So a tip is to make the question very specific, a specific cause, a specific effect, and a certain condition. So some examples here, like the first one, does bend radius affect loss in single mode fibers at 1550 nanometers? Well, our cause would be bend radius and varying our bend radius, and the effect would be loss and how we see loss change as a result of bend radius changing. And the conditions would be single mode fibers at a specific wavelength. And the second one does the same thing, and you can read over that one. And maybe try and identify what the cause, effect, and conditions are in the second example. And now it's time to create a testable hypothesis. So you can think of it as the sentence I have on screen, which is if a cause changes, then the effect changes because of something, and that'll usually be a principle of science. So an example is if bend radius decreases, then loss increases exponentially because weaker mode confinement leaks light. And so the first part would be your cause, the second part is your effect, and then the because statement is the why that happens. And the because statement is very important. You can't just state why you think, or you can't just state that a cause will cause some kind of effect without formulating a hypothesis on why you think that effect will occur. And so now it's time to define our variables. And so there are three you should think about: independent variables, dependent variables, and control variables. So the independent variable is what you vary intentionally. So like bend radius, we're changing it intentionally to produce an effect, and that effect is a dependent variable. So we're not changing the dependent variable, but it is a result of us changing the independent variable. And control variables are very important too because they define the conditions of our experiment. And if we change them, then they could cause some discrepancies between causation factors. So we need to keep the wavelength, fiber type, number of turns, light, temperature, and connector cleanliness the same in the case of my experiment in order to definitively conclude that the dependent variable was caused by changes in the independent variable. Now we're going to plan the protocol, and I have 4 steps on screen, but it doesn't have to be these 4 steps. You can plan it how you see fit, but these are some guidelines if you don't know where to start. So first, think about what materials you might need for your project or experiment, and then the procedure that you're going to create. Now this can be hard, and sometimes you might have to refine the procedure to find the best way. In our example, in my experiment, I talk more about how I conducted my experiment in the previous video, in which you should go watch if you haven't. But here are some conditions of my experiment below. So I tested these radii, and I did 3 replicates for each radii, and I cleaned the connectors before each run, which was my protocol. Taking measurements can be pretty difficult. Make sure to record raw numbers. Don't round anything. You want to keep your significant digits. If you lose them, then the accuracy of your experiment goes down, and you should report that in the next section. You also want to note down anything you think could be affecting your experiment, which is important to talk about later in your interpretation and analysis section. So things like background noise, temperature, or lighting that could affect your experiment, you should note down when you're taking measurements. So the next part is data analysis. You want to consider things like how you're going to plot your data. Do you want a scatter plot, a line graph, and then what model you're going to fit to your data? Is it better to do exponential fit or linear fit depending on your experiment? And then you want to report uncertainty in your experiment because nothing is ever perfect. So you'll talk about standard deviation, confidence intervals, which can be calculated or they might be stated in the documentation of the equipment that you're using. And then statistics of your graphs, like R-squared regression values. And then you want to interpret these results in like questions like, did you prove, refute your hypothesis? What are the reasons for your results? Limitations of your experiment, or implications for further research? And so this is more thinking like a scientist, because we're always improving our scientific method, and we want to always get better and better with each iteration. So your first experiment may not be perfect, but understanding how it could be better and what limited your results is very important to the scientific process. Lastly, here are some common mistakes that people make when conducting experiments. If you change two things at once, then you're not sure which one caused your dependent variable to change. And so that would not prove a causation, and therefore your experiment is not the most accurate. Another thing is having more replicates is generally better because it will you could average your results and it would decrease measurement inaccuracy. Another thing is hiding outliers instead of explaining them. You're not always going to get perfect data, and it's better to highlight your outliers and explain why you think this occurred. It's more beneficial to your research than just outright ignoring them. Another one is using the wrong plot. So sometimes it can be hard to determine what kind of plot you want to make with your data. So for my experiment specifically, I wanted to prove an exponential relationship between loss per turn when radius changes. And so in order to prove that, I plotted a semi-logarithmic plot. And so when you take a log of an exponent, you should see that the result is linear. And by seeing that my data was actually linear when I plotted a log plot, it proved my exponential dependence. So sometimes you want to be thinking about what kind of plot you want to be using or what kind of trend line you want to be using. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to hear about your experiments in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.